There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that retrospectively cleave your personal history into a distinct before and after. They rarely announce themselves with thunder or fanfare. Instead, they slip in quietly on a Tuesday night, wearing the comfortable clothes of routine, and only later do you recognize them as the architects of your entire future. For me, that moment was a question, whispered into the shared silence of our living room, a space that had for years been a sanctuary of platonic safety. The air was thick with the low hum of the city 10 floors below and the scent of old books and the lavender laundry detergent Julian insisted on using. He was a creature of habit, of comforting constants, and for the longest time, I had believed I was one of them, a fixed point in the constellation of his life. But that night, the fixed points began to drift, and the familiar map of our friendship started to look like unexplored territory. His head was in my lap, a common enough occurrence in the months following his breakup with Sarah. It had become a kind of unspoken ritual, a quiet concession to the exhaustion that had settled deep into his bones. The weight of him was a familiar pressure against my thighs, a solid, living anchor that paradoxically made my own heart feel dangerously buoyant, threatening to float right out of my chest. I was tracing the seam on his gray sweatshirt with my thumb, a mindless, repetitive motion that kept my hands from doing what they truly wanted to do, which was to sink into the dark silk of his hair. I had become a master of such small, precise negotiations with myself, a cartographer of boundaries that only I could see. The television was on, but the volume was a barely audible murmur, playing some forgettable documentary about deep-sea life that neither of us was watching. The real drama was in the space between us, in the charged stillness that felt as deep and mysterious as the oceanic trenches flickering on the screen. He shifted, a subtle adjustment of his weight that sent a current of awareness through me, and the lazy rhythm of my thumb faltered. He tilted his head back, his eyes finding mine in the dim, ambient glow filtering through the large window. His gaze was usually so clear, so direct, a brilliant, uncomplicated blue. But tonight, it was clouded, murky with an emotion I couldn't name, and it felt like looking down into water that was too deep to see the bottom. My own breath caught somewhere in my throat, a knot of apprehension and a fragile, terrifying hope. He was going to say something. I could feel the words gathering in him, the same way you can feel the pressure in the airdrop just before a storm. I braced myself for a confession of lingering sadness over his ex, or a complaint about his job, the usual currency of our late-night conversations. Can I try something? The question was so quiet it was almost consumed by the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. It was not what I had expected. The words hung in the air between us, small and yet possessing an impossible gravity. Try something. It was a phrase of experimentation, of uncertainty, of permission. It was a door handle turning in a wall I had long since believed to be solid. My entire internal world, a carefully constructed fortress of self-denial and managed expectations, went silent. All the noise, all the frantic internal monologues, all the quiet pining that had been the soundtrack to my life for 5 years simply ceased. In its place was a profound, echoing quiet, waiting for my response. I couldn't form a word. My throat was a desert. So I just nodded, a small, jerky movement that felt both like a surrender and a leap of faith. I thought he might sit up. I thought he might lean in to kiss me, a straightforward, if terrifying, confirmation of what the question implied. My mind raced ahead, trying to build the next moment before it arrived, a frantic and futile act of self-preservation. But Julian did neither of those things. He remained where he was, his head heavy in my lap, his gaze still locked on mine. And then, with a slowness that was both excruciating and exquisite, he lowered his gaze from my eyes and dipped his head. I felt the soft brush of his hair against my stomach, through the thin cotton of my t-shirt, and then the impossible warmth of his lips pressed against the sensitive skin just above the waistband of my jeans. My entire body went rigid. It was not a kiss of passion, but of inquiry. It was a question being asked in a language I was only just beginning to understand. He lingered there for a beat, a single, searing point of contact, and then he began to move. His lips traced a slow, deliberate path upward, over the fabric of my shirt, a pilgrimage across the territories of my body that had always been strictly off-limits. Each point of pressure was a revelation, a starburst of sensation that lit up the darkness behind my closed eyelids. I felt the damp heat of his breath through the cotton, and then his mouth found the exposed skin of my neck, just below my ear. The kiss was soft, questioning, and then another, and another, a slow, languid descent down the column of my throat, toward the frantic pulse at its base. He wasn't asking for anything. He was mapping me. He was discovering me. And in the beautiful, terrifying silence of our living room, with the deep-sea creatures swimming obliviously on the screen, I felt myself being redrawn, rewritten, irrevocably and completely changed. To understand the sheer seismic impact of that moment, you have to understand the foundation upon which our friendship was built. It was a structure I had helped design, a fortress of platonic camaraderie with walls so high and thick that I myself had come to believe they were impenetrable. I met Julian during my sophomore year of college. He was the sun around which a certain social sphere orbited, the star forward on the university's soccer team, effortlessly charming, with a laugh that could fill any room and a kindness that seemed almost incongruous with his level of campus fame. I, on the other hand, was a quiet observer by nature and by trade. I was a photography student, most comfortable behind a lens, cataloging the world from a slight, safe distance. My camera was both a shield and a bridge. It allowed me to be present at the periphery of life without having to fully participate in its messy, unpredictable center. I was assigned to cover the athletics department for the student newspaper, a job I took for the credits and the access it gave me to interesting subjects. I spent countless hours on the sidelines of fields and courts, my lens focused on the peak of action, the strain of a muscle, the flash of victory or defeat in an athlete's eyes. I photographed Julian dozens of times before we ever spoke a word. He was an incredible subject, a study in kinetic grace. But what fascinated me more were the moments in between the plays. The way he'd scan the crowd, the brief flash of something that looked like loneliness in his eyes after a big win, the quiet way he'd help a player from the opposing team up off the turf. My camera captured these things, these fleeting, interstitial moments that seemed to tell a truer story than the final score. One afternoon, I was in the campus darkroom, the alchemical scent of developer and stop bath clinging to the air, watching one of these images of him materialize in the tray. It was a shot from after a major game they'd lost in the final seconds. Most of the team was visibly dejected, but Julian was standing alone, away from the huddle, his face turned towards the emptying stands, caught in the long, dramatic shadows of the stadium lights. There was no anger in his expression, just a profound, contemplative stillness. It was a portrait of quiet resilience, and it was, I thought, one of the best photographs I had ever taken. "That's a great shot." The voice came from the doorway, and I nearly dropped my developing tongs. It was Julian, still in his practice gear, his hair damp with sweat. He was backlit by the hallway light, a silhouette that was instantly recognizable. I was so used to seeing him through a viewfinder that his actual, three-dimensional presence in my small, dark sanctuary felt like a violation of some fundamental law of physics. He stepped inside, letting the heavy doors swing shut behind him, plunging us back into the dim, safe red light of the darkroom. He pointed towards the print hanging from a line to dry. "The one from the game against Northwood," he said. "You really caught the mood of that evening." I was floored that he even recognized the specific game, let alone that he would seek me out in the labyrinthine basement of the arts building. I mumbled something about the lighting being good, the default deflection of a photographer who is uncomfortable taking credit. But he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the row of my prints, his gaze moving from one to the next with a surprising intensity. He looked at a stark, black and white photo of a cracked sidewalk, a portrait of an elderly woman sitting on a park bench, and a series I'd done on the architecture of forgotten spaces. He didn't just glance, he studied them. "You see things differently, don't you?" he asked, finally turning his blue eyes on me. It wasn't a compliment so much as a genuine question. It's like, you're looking for the story underneath the story. And just like that, he saw me, in a way no one else really had. He saw past the quiet, awkward art student and understood the intention behind my work, the driving force of my personality. That was the beginning. Our friendship bloomed in the spaces between our two vastly different worlds. We'd meet for coffee between his practices and my classes. He'd come to the darkroom and watch me work, asking endless questions about f-stops and focal lengths, seemingly fascinated by the slow, deliberate magic of the process. In turn, I started actually watching his games, not just as a photographer, but as a fan, as a friend. I learned the nuances of the sport, the strategy, the silent communication between the players. I saw the incredible intelligence and discipline that underpinned his seemingly effortless talent. We became each other's confidants. He'd talk about the immense pressure to perform, the weight of his scholarship, the complex dynamics of his team. I'd talk about the struggle to find my artistic voice, the terror of a blank page, the daunting prospect of trying to make a living from my passion. We were the keepers of each other's anxieties. After graduation, the idea of not living in the same city felt like a physical amputation. He had a lucrative job offer from a software engineering firm downtown, and I was scraping by with freelance gigs and a part-time job at a camera shop. It was Julian who suggested we get an apartment together. It made financial sense, he'd argued, a perfectly logical, practical solution. But for me, it felt like a miracle. We found a 2-bedroom place in a decent neighborhood, a blank canvas that we slowly filled with our lives. He brought his sprawling, comfortable couch and his ridiculously large television. I brought my collection of photography books, my prints to hang on the walls, and a quiet, persistent ache in my chest whenever I looked at him for too long. Because, of course, I was in love with him. It had happened slowly, then all at once, a creeping tide that eventually submerged everything. It was in the way he'd concentrate, a small furrow appearing between his brows. It was in the unself-conscious way he'd sing off-key in the shower. It was in the fierce loyalty he showed to the people he cared about. I loved him, and I was absolutely, pathologically certain that he did not, and could not, love me back in the same way. Julian dated women. Beautiful, smart, funny women who were as bright and outgoing as he was. I met them all. There was Emily in our senior year, and then Chloe after graduation, and for the last 2 years, it had been Sarah. I was always the supportive friend, the good roommate. I'd offer them drinks when they came over, listen to Julian's relationship woes, and give him advice that felt like swallowing shards of glass. I built my walls high. My love for him was a secret garden I tended to in the darkest hours of the night, a place I never allowed to see the light of day. Our friendship was too precious, too vital. It was the central pillar of my life, and I would have sooner cut off my own arm than risk demolishing it with the messy, inconvenient truth of my feelings. I learned to live in the space he allotted me, to cherish the platonic intimacy we shared. I convinced myself it was enough. The easy camaraderie, the shared meals, the movie nights on the couch. It was a good life, a life I was lucky to have. I was the keeper of the flame of our friendship, and my primary duty was to protect it, even from myself. My camera had taught me how to frame a scene, how to crop out the unwanted elements to create a more pleasing composition. I did the same with my own life. I framed our friendship as the centerpiece and cropped my own yearning heart right out of the picture. I thought I had created a masterpiece of self-control, a perfectly balanced, stable image. I had no idea it was all about to be burned in the developer, exposed to a light I never saw coming. The shift began not with a bang, but with a long, drawn-out sigh of defeat. It was a Wednesday in late October, the kind of evening where the autumn chill had a real bite to it, promising an early winter. I was in the kitchen, editing a set of photos from a recent wedding gig, the soft click of my mouse a rhythmic counterpoint to the hiss of the radiator. Julian came home later than usual. I heard his key in the lock, the familiar sound of the deadbolt sliding back, but there was a hesitation before the door opened, a pause that was out of character. He walked in and didn't say a word. He just dropped his messenger bag by the door with a heavy thud, kicked off his shoes, and walked straight to the couch, where he collapsed face down into a cushion. His silence was a heavy blanket thrown over the apartment. Julian was never this quiet. He was a processor, a talker. He came home and narrated the absurdities of his office, the triumphs of his coding projects, the latest gossip from his team. His energy usually flooded our shared space the moment he walked in the door. This was different. This was a void. I waited a few minutes, giving him space, before I walked into the living room. His broad back rose and fell with each slow breath, his body a solid line of exhaustion. "Tough day?" I asked, my voice gentle. He didn't move, His voice was muffled by the upholstery. "Sarah and I broke up." The words landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. I felt a complex and shameful cocktail of emotions, a pang of sympathy for his pain, because I knew how much he had cared for her, and a tiny, traitorous flicker of something that felt horribly like relief. I immediately suppressed it, burying it under a layer of genuine concern. They had been together for 2 years. It had been serious. There had been talk of them moving in together, a possibility that had loomed in my mind like a gathering storm cloud for months. "Oh, man," I said, sitting on the arm of the couch, not wanting to crowd him. "I'm so sorry. What happened?" He finally rolled over, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were red-rimmed, not from crying, but from a deep, soul-crushing weariness. "The usual, I guess," he sighed, staring up at the ceiling. "We just want different things. She thinks I'm emotionally distant, that I don't let her in. She said it feels like I have this whole other life she's not a part of." He gestured vaguely around our apartment. "This life." His words sent a chill through me. She had seen it. She had seen the walls he had, the same way I had walls of my own. But she had interpreted his inner world, his quiet core that he shared so easily with me, as a rejection of her. He wasn't emotionally distant. He just spoke a different emotional language, one of quiet presence and shared space, a language I had become fluent in over the years. He didn't need to narrate his every feeling to feel close to someone. He just needed them to be there, to share the silence. That night was the first crack in the dam. He didn't want to talk about it anymore. He just asked if we could watch a movie, something stupid and loud that required no emotional investment. We did. And for the first time, when he started to drift off, instead of retreating to his own bed, he just shifted, rested his head in my lap, and fell into a deep, troubled sleep. I sat there for hours, my legs cramping, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, listening to the sound of his breathing and feeling like I was guarding something incredibly fragile. In the weeks that followed, the change was profound. It was a gradual erosion of the old boundaries, a slow redrawing of our domestic map. Julian's social energy, once a brilliant, outward-facing supernova, collapsed inward. He stopped making plans with his other friends on weekends. He declined invitations for after-work drinks. His world seemed to shrink until it was contained almost entirely within the 4 walls of our apartment. He was like a great ship that had lost its rudder, and he had drifted into the only safe harbor he knew, me. He was present, but he was also absent. He'd sit on the couch for hours, scrolling aimlessly through his phone, or just staring out the window at the city lights. The vibrant, kinetic energy that had always defined him was replaced by a heavy, static presence. It was the stillness I'd captured in that photograph years ago, but now it wasn't a fleeting moment. It had become his entire state of being. And he began to seek a new kind of comfort from me, a physical comfort that tiptoed carefully along the edges of our established friendship. It was a language of touch, spoken in hushed, deniable gestures. It was a hand lingering on my shoulder for a moment too long as he passed behind me. It was the way he'd lean against me when we were standing in the kitchen, waiting for the kettle to boil, a casual press of his side against mine that felt anything but casual. He was leaning on me, not just emotionally, but literally, as if he needed my physical presence to keep himself upright. I became a student of his proximity, my body a finely tuned instrument calibrated to the slightest shift in the space between us. I was hyper-aware of him, of the heat radiating from his skin, of the scent of his shampoo, of the soft sound of his sigh. My life, which had once been about observing the world from a distance, was now an intense, microscopic study of a single human being. And I was terrified, because every part of me was screaming with a hope I had promised myself I would never entertain. I told myself I was just being a good friend. He was hurting, and I was his anchor. But every night, as I lay in my own bed, I could feel the foundations of the fortress I had so carefully built beginning to crumble into dust. The ritual began subtly, as most profound changes do. It started with the couch. Our couch was large and deep, a comfortable behemoth of worn leather that had been the centerpiece of our shared living space since we'd moved in. It was neutral territory, a place for movies, for conversations, for companionable silence. But in the aftermath of Julian's breakup, it transformed. It became a vessel for a new, unspoken form of intimacy. At first, It was just him falling asleep during a movie, his head eventually slumping against my shoulder. I would sit perfectly still, my own muscles screaming in protest, unwilling to disturb him. I'd tell myself it was a simple act of friendship, of offering comfort to someone who was hurting. It was a kindness, nothing more. My heart, however, was telling a very different story. It was singing a wild, dangerous song of proximity and possibility. Then, the act became more intentional. He stopped pretending to fall asleep by accident. He would just settle in at the beginning of a movie, shifting until he found a comfortable position, and then, with a soft sigh, he would rest his head in my lap. The first time he did it with such clear purpose, my entire nervous system went into overdrive. I felt the warmth of his scalp through the thin denim of my jeans, the soft tickle of his hair against my hand, which rested, frozen, on the cushion beside him. I could feel the rhythmic pulse of the blood in his carotid artery if I dared to move my fingers just a few inches. It was an intimacy so profound, so far beyond the established rules of our friendship, that it felt like a dream. But it was real. The solid weight of him was irrefutably real. I lived for those evenings, and I dreaded them in equal measure. They were a form of exquisite torture. My mind would race, analyzing every nuance of the situation. This meant nothing, I'd tell myself. It was purely about comfort, like a cat seeking a warm place to sleep. He was using me as a pillow, a human heating pad. He was lonely and sad, and this was a physical manifestation of his need for uncomplicated solace. There was no romantic intent. There couldn't be. To believe otherwise was to set myself up for a catastrophic fall. And yet, another part of me, a braver, more foolish part, would meticulously catalog the evidence to the contrary. The way he would sometimes sigh in his sleep and shift closer, his hand coming to rest on my leg. The way, on a few occasions, he had woken up and not moved away immediately, but had simply stayed there, looking up at me with those sleepy, unguarded blue eyes, a soft, unreadable expression on his face. Then came the second phase of the ritual, the open door. For 5 years, Julian had been a creature of habit and privacy. When he went to bed, he closed his bedroom door. It was a simple, definitive act, a signal that he had retreated into his own space for the night. The closed door was a physical representation of the boundary between his life and mine, a boundary I had always respected. But then, one night about a month after the breakup, I got up for a glass of water and saw that his door was ajar. A thin slice of light from the hallway cut across his floor. I could hear the soft, even sound of his breathing from within. I stood in the hallway for a full minute, my heart pounding. It was probably nothing. He was tired, he'd forgotten. But the next night, it was open again. And the night after that. The open door became an obsession. It was a silent, ambiguous signal that I spent hours trying to decode. Was it an invitation? A sign of a new, porous boundary between us? Or was it simply a symptom of his distracted, melancholic state, a forgotten detail in a life that had become untethered? I would lie awake in my own room, staring at my own closed door, intensely aware of that narrow opening down the hall. It felt like a question hanging in the dark, a question I was too afraid to answer. I imagined walking down the hall, pushing the door open, seeing him in his bed. What would I do? What would he do? The scenarios that played out in my mind were a mix of terrifying and beautiful, and I never acted on any of them. I simply observed, analyzed, and waited, a prisoner of hope and fear. The ritual reached its apex on a cold, rain-lashed night in December. I was woken from a shallow sleep by a sound from the hallway. I sat up, my senses on high alert. The floorboards outside my room creaked, a sound I knew was followed by a pause. Then, a soft knock on my door. My heart leaped into my throat. Leo. Julian's voice was a low whisper. You awake? I cleared my throat, my own voice thick with sleep. Yeah. What's up? The door opened a crack, and his silhouette filled the space. I had a nightmare, he said, and he sounded younger than I had ever heard him, his voice stripped of all its usual confidence. Stupid, I know. It's not stupid, I said immediately, flipping on the small lamp on my nightstand. The soft, warm light filled the room, and I could see his face. He looked pale and genuinely spooked. He hesitated in the doorway, clutching the frame as if for support. Can I? Is it okay if I just stay in here for a bit? He asked, the words tumbling out in a rush. I don't want to be alone. My room was not large. It contained my queen-sized bed, a dresser, and a desk cluttered with camera equipment. There was no other place for him to be. The unspoken offer, the only possible interpretation of his request, hung in the air between us. My bed. He was asking to get into my bed. This was no longer an ambiguous signal. This was a direct, explicit request that shattered every remaining boundary we had. Of course, I heard myself say, the words feeling like they were coming from someone else, someone braver and more reckless than I was. I shifted over to one side of the bed, pulling the comforter back for him. He slipped into the room, closing the door quietly behind him, and slid into the space beside me. The mattress dipped with his weight. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, a rigid line of tension. I did the same. We were 2 feet apart, a vast, arctic expanse of white sheets between us, but I was so aware of him it felt like my skin was on fire. We lay there in silence for what felt like an eternity. The only sounds were the rain against the window and the frantic, silent beating of my own heart. "Thanks," he finally whispered into the dark. "Anytime," I whispered back. That night became the first of many. It was always preceded by a pretext, a nightmare, the sound of the wind being too loud, a feeling of anxiety he couldn't shake. Plausible deniability was always maintained. But the ritual was established. He would come into my room, and we would lie in the dark, sometimes talking in low voices, but more often just sharing the silence. Over time, the space between us began to shrink. One night, we fell asleep back to back, the warmth of his body a solid presence against mine. Another night, I woke up to find we had both rolled onto our sides, and we were facing each other, his face only inches from mine, his breath a warm puff against my cheek. I would lie there, feigning sleep, memorizing the shape of his eyelashes, the curve of his lips in the pre-dawn light. This ritual was the source of my greatest comfort and my most intense anxiety. I was living in a state of suspended disbelief, a fragile, beautiful bubble of intimacy that I knew could be popped by a single wrong move, a single misinterpreted word, a single breath taken at the wrong time. I was a quiet observer, trapped inside the most compelling photograph I had ever been a part of, terrified to move for fear of blurring the image. We had reached the quiet apex of the ritual. It was a Friday night, nearly 2 months after he had first knocked on my bedroom door. The pretext for sharing a bed had long since dissolved. Now, it was simply the default. After a movie, he would follow me down the hall to my room as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The couch had become the antechamber to this new, more profound level of intimacy. That night, however, we never made it off the couch. A light snow had begun to fall outside, the fat, wet flakes sticking to the window pane and muffling the sounds of the city into a soft, hushed drone. The world outside felt distant, unreal. The only reality was the small, warm bubble of our living room, lit by a single floor lamp that cast a pool of golden light around us. Julian was in his customary position, head in my lap, but something was different. The usual sleepy, pliant weight of him was gone, replaced by a subtle tension. He wasn't drifting off. He was awake, intensely awake. I could feel it in the stillness of his body, a stillness that was not relaxed, but coiled, like a spring. I had stopped tracing the seams of his clothes weeks ago. My hand now rested naturally in his hair, my fingers gently combing through the soft strands. It was a gesture that had become as normal as breathing, and yet, tonight, it felt charged with a new significance. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, saturated with unspoken questions, with the accumulated weight of all the nights spent sharing space, sharing breath, sharing everything but the truth. I looked down at him. The lamplight caught the sharp line of his jaw, the gentle curve of his throat. I watched the slow, steady pulse beating there, a visible manifestation of the life thrumming just beneath his skin. My own heart was a frantic, erratic thing, a trapped bird beating against my ribs. I had a premonition, a deep, cellular certainty that the bubble we had been living in was about to burst. The fragile equilibrium we had maintained for months was becoming unstable. Something had to give. I thought it might be me. I thought that after all this time, the words I had held back for years might finally spill out, a messy, catastrophic confession. But it was him. He shifted, just as he had on that first night, tilting his head back to look at me. His blue eyes, which I knew as well as I knew the back of my own hand, were dark and deep in the dim light, and they were filled with an unnerving mix of vulnerability and resolve. The air grew thick, heavy. I felt as though I was underwater, every movement slow and deliberate, every sound amplified. I could hear the whisper of the fabric of his shirt as he moved, the soft intake of his breath. "Can I try something?" There it was again. The same question. The same 5 words that had heralded the beginning of this strange, beautiful, terrifying chapter of our lives. But this time, they didn't feel like an exploration into the unknown. They felt like a destination. They felt like a choice that had already been made. He was not asking for permission to experiment. He was asking for permission to arrive. The fortress I had built around my heart, the one that had been crumbling for months, finally gave way. All the fear, all the carefully constructed denial, all the logical reasons why this was impossible, washed away, leaving behind only a raw, terrifying, and exquisitely simple desire. I wanted him. I wanted whatever he was offering. My nod was barely perceptible, a tremor that ran through my entire body. A universe of meaning passed between us in that small gesture. It was consent. It was surrender. It was a quiet, desperate yes. He didn't move for a long moment, his gaze holding mine, searching for something. Doubt, hesitation, fear. He must have found none, or perhaps he found all of them and chose to proceed anyway. With a slowness that felt both sacred and agonizing, he pushed himself up, levering his body with his elbows until he was half-sitting, his face level with mine. The space between us was now electric, a humming, vibrant emptiness that begged to be filled. His eyes flickered down to my mouth, and then back up to my eyes. It was the most explicit question he had ever asked, and he did it without saying a word. And then he leaned in. He closed the final few inches between us, and his lips met mine. It was not the passionate, desperate kiss I had sometimes imagined in my loneliest moments. It was something far more profound. It was tentative, soft, a gentle press of his mouth against mine. It was a question, a confession, and an apology all at once. It tasted of salt and hope. His lips were impossibly soft, and for a moment, I was too stunned to respond. I was just a receiver of this incredible, unbelievable sensation. Then, my own body came back to life. My hand, which had been frozen in his hair, moved, my fingers tightening, pulling him fractionally closer. I kissed him back. I met his gentleness with my own, a quiet, mutual agreement. It was the crossing of a line so significant that I knew, with absolute certainty, that there was no going back. We had stepped out of the old country of our friendship and into a new, uncharted territory, and we had done it together. The kiss ended as softly as it began. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. His breath was warm on my face. "Okay," he whispered, the word a soft puff of air. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. It was the sound of a lock clicking into place. "Okay," I whispered back, and the silence that followed was not the silence of tension or ambiguity. It was the sound of peace. It was the sound of coming home. The morning after was a study in silence and absence. I woke up alone. The space beside me in the bed was cool to the touch, the indentation of his body already fading from the sheets. For a moment, a hazy, dreamlike confusion clouded my mind. Had it happened? The kiss on the couch, the soft, world-altering pressure of his lips on mine? But then I saw it. The lamp on my nightstand was still on, casting a pale, sickly light in the gray dawn, and my bedroom door was slightly ajar, just as we had left it when we had finally moved from the living room. It was real. A jolt of pure, unadulterated joy shot through me, so potent it made me dizzy. It was real. I got up, a smile stretching my face, feeling lighter than I had in years. I walked into the living room, expecting to find him in the kitchen, making coffee, expecting to meet his eyes and see a reflection of my own happiness. But the apartment was empty. His messenger bag was gone from its usual spot by the door. His running shoes were missing. A small, handwritten note was on the kitchen counter. My heart, which had been soaring, plummeted. I picked it up with trembling fingers. Went for a run. Needed to clear my head. "See you later. See you later." The words were so casual, so utterly normal, and yet they felt like a wall of ice. Needed to clear my head. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of my joy. Why did he need to clear his head? Wasn't what happened clear enough? The day crawled by in a state of agonizing suspense. Later turned out to be very late. He didn't come home after his run. My texts went unanswered for hours, and when he finally replied, it was with short, non-committal phrases. Stuck at the office, grabbing dinner with a coworker, don't wait up. Each message was a small, polite stone added to the wall he was clearly building between us. When he finally came home, it was well after midnight. I had been pretending to read on the couch for hours, the same page of a book staring up at me, the words a meaningless jumble. I heard his key in the lock, and I braced myself. He walked in, saw me, and visibly flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible reaction that felt like a physical blow. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Hey," he said, his voice strained as he toed off his shoes. "You're still up." I was worried. I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "You didn't answer your phone for a while." "Sorry. It was a long day," he mumbled, already moving towards his bedroom, towards his closed door. The door that had been ajar for months was now shut, a solid, oak statement of his withdrawal. "Julian," I said, my voice cracking slightly, "can we please talk about last night?" He stopped with his hand on his doorknob, his back still to me. I saw his shoulders slump. "I'm really tired, Leo," he said, his voice low. "Can we do this another time?" "No," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my tone. I stood up. "No, we can't. Because I feel like I'm going crazy. Did I misinterpret everything? Did I imagine it?" He finally turned around, and the look on his face shattered my heart. He looked lost, cornered, and deeply, profoundly miserable. The confident, resolute man who had kissed me with such tender certainty was gone, replaced by a frightened stranger. "I don't know," he whispered, and the words were devastating. "I don't know what I'm doing." The days that followed were the worst of my life. Worse than the years of silent pining. Worse than the agony of watching him with his girlfriends. This was a new and special kind of hell. It was the pain of a hope that had been allowed to bloom, only to be violently uprooted. Julian was a ghost in our apartment. We moved around each other like strangers, the space between us charged with a painful, suffocating tension. He was polite, distant. He worked late every night. His bedroom door remained firmly, unequivocally closed. The rituals we had built, the couch, the open door, the shared bed, they were all gone, artifacts of a forgotten civilization. I spiraled. I replayed the kiss, the weeks leading up to it, every glance, every touch, searching for the moment I got it wrong. Had I been too eager? Had my response scared him? Had he kissed me out of pity, or loneliness, or some drunken, momentary confusion, and then woken up in the cold light of day, filled with regret? I felt like a fool, exposed and humiliated. The beautiful, intimate world we had built felt like a cruel joke, and I was the punchline. My anger began to curdle my hurt. Anger at him for his cowardice, for starting something he was too afraid to finish. And anger at myself for being so naive, for letting my guard down, for daring to believe that I could be loved in the way I so desperately wanted. After a week of this torturous silence, I knew I couldn't survive it any longer. The friendship, the foundation of my entire adult life, was already dead. The silence was killing it. If it was going to end, it would not be with this pathetic, whimpering quiet. It would end with the truth. I waited up for him again, but this time, I wasn't waiting for an explanation. I was demanding one. He came in, looking exhausted as always, and tried to slip past me towards his room. I stepped in his way. "Don't," I said, my voice low and shaking with a week's worth of repressed emotion. "Don't you dare walk away from me again." He looked up, startled by my tone. "Leo, I can't do this right now." "Yes, you can," I insisted, my voice rising. "You owe me this. You don't get to come into my life, into my bed, into my head, and then just walk away because you're scared. You don't get to kiss me like that, and then pretend it never happened. What do you want from me, Julian?" The question came out as a raw, ragged plea. "Just tell me. If it was a mistake, just say it. I can take it. But this silence, this cowardice, I can't. It's destroying me." Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and angry. I saw his own eyes well up, his carefully constructed composure finally shattering. He leaned his head against the wall, his shoulders shaking. "I'm sorry," he choked out, his voice thick with unshed tears. "God, Leo, I'm so sorry." He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head in his hands. I sank down in front of him, the anger draining out of me, replaced by a vast, aching sadness. "I'm not a mistake," he whispered into his palms. "You're not a mistake. I'm just so scared. I've been so confused. When Sarah left, she said I was hiding, and she was right. But I didn't know what I was hiding from. And then it was just you. Everything was just you. Being here, with you, was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that made sense. I needed to be near you. I needed it like air." He finally looked up at me, his face a mess of tear tracks and confusion. "I've never felt this way about anyone," he said, his voice cracking. "About a guy? About a friend. I didn't know what it was. I didn't want to know. I thought if I didn't name it, it couldn't be real. But it was. And that night, kissing you, it was the most real thing I have ever felt in my entire life. And it terrified me, because it means everything has to change. And I don't know how to do that." He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of accepting himself. He was afraid of the same thing I had been afraid of for years, demolishing the life we knew to build something new and unknown. His withdrawal wasn't about me. It was about him. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from the truth the kiss had revealed. All the anger, all the hurt, dissolved in that moment of shared, painful honesty. He was just as lost as I was. We were two people standing in the rubble of the world we had known, scared and uncertain, but for the first time, we were looking at the same wreckage, and we were finally speaking the same language. The confession hung in the hallway between us, raw and resonant. It was the sound of a dam breaking, years of confusion and unspoken feelings pouring out into the open. We stayed there on the floor for a long time, the silence no longer a weapon but a space for healing. The harsh overhead light of the hallway felt too bright, too exposing, so I reached up and switched it off, leaving us in the soft, forgiving darkness, punctuated only by the slivers of city light from the living room window. His ragged breaths slowly evened out. My own tears subsided, leaving behind a clean, quiet ache. The storm had passed, and now we were left to survey the landscape. "I've loved you for years," I said into the quiet. The words came out without their usual weight of fear and shame. They were just a fact, a piece of the map I was laying out on the floor between us. I just got very good at hiding it. "I was just as scared as you are of ruining this." I gestured around us, at the apartment, at the invisible architecture of our friendship. He let out a long, shaky breath that was half sob, half laugh. "Years?" he asked, his voice full of wonder and a deep, aching regret. "God, Leo, I'm so stupid. I've been so blind." "No," I said, shaking my head. "You weren't ready to see it. And I wasn't brave enough to show you. We weren't standing on opposite sides of a chasm anymore." His confession had built a bridge. It was fragile, untested, but it was there. We were finally on the same side, looking at the same frightening, beautiful horizon. Slowly, I reached out and laid my hand on his knee. He didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he covered my hand with his own, his fingers lacing through mine. His skin was cold, but his grip was firm, a silent anchor. It was the first intentional, honest touch that had passed between us since the kiss, and it felt more significant than any of the ambiguous cuddling or shared beds that had come before. This was real. This had no pretext. We eventually moved from the cold floor of the hallway to the familiar comfort of the couch. We didn't turn on the television. We just sat, side by side, our hands still intertwined on the cushion between us. The awkward, painful distance that had defined the past week was gone, replaced by a quiet, deliberate closeness. We started to talk, really talk, for the first time. He spoke of the loneliness that had been a constant, low hum beneath the surface of his life, even during his relationships. He talked about the sense of peace he only ever felt here, in this apartment, with me. I talked about the dual life I'd been leading, the public-facing supportive friend and the private, yearning man who analyzed his every move. We laid our secrets out like old photographs, exposing them to the light, and found that they were not ugly or shameful, but were simply parts of our shared story. There was no grand, cinematic moment of resolution. There was no passionate kiss to seal the deal. It was something quieter and far more meaningful. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, he turned to me, his eyes clear and tired, but peaceful for the first time in weeks. Can we just start over? He asked softly. Not from the beginning, but from here, from right now, with no more pretending. I'd like that, I said, my voice thick with emotion. And so we did. We began the slow, careful process of building something new on the foundations of the old. The change was in the small things. The next morning, he made coffee for both of us, and when he handed me my mug, he let his fingers linger against mine, and he met my eyes with a small, shy smile. It was a simple gesture, but it was an earthquake. When he left for work, he paused at the door. I'll be home for dinner, he said. It wasn't a statement of logistics. It was a promise. A promise to return, to not run away. The ritual of the closed door found a new meaning. One night, a few days later, as we were getting ready for bed, he walked with me to my room. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped inside. He walked over to my bed, pulled back the covers on the side he had come to claim as his own, and looked at me. It was a silent, clear invitation. There was no pretext of a nightmare, no excuse of anxiety. It was a choice. I walked over and quietly closed my bedroom door, and when I turned back to him, he was smiling. The boundary was no longer a wall between us, but a circle drawn around us, protecting our new, fragile world from the outside. We slept facing each other that night, his arm draped over my waist, my head tucked under his chin. For the first time, sleeping next to him was not a source of anxiety, but of a profound, unshakable peace. I fell asleep to the steady, comforting rhythm of his heart beating against my ear. We were learning a new choreography of domestic intimacy, holding hands while we walked down the street. A quick, soft kiss in the kitchen while waiting for toast to pop. The easy, unspoken way we now shared a single bed every night. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was something better. It was a slow, gentle unfolding, a process of discovery. I was still an observer, but I was no longer on the outside looking in. My camera, which had once been my shield, now felt like a tool to celebrate what we were building. I started taking pictures of him again, not as a distant subject, but as the center of my world. A photo of his hand resting on a book, the way the morning light caught the sleep lines on his face. They were quiet portraits of happiness, images of a peace I had once thought impossible. We never really defined what we were. The words boyfriend or partner felt too small, too conventional for the journey we had taken. We were just Leo and Julian. We were home. The term was no longer a place, a collection of rooms and furniture. It was the quiet space between us, the shared silence that was now filled not with tension, but with love. It was the feeling of his hand finding mine in the dark. We had navigated the treacherous waters of ambiguity and fear, and had arrived on a shore that was more beautiful than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. We had found our way not by following a map, but by closing our eyes, listening to our hearts, and taking a terrifying, wonderful leap of faith together. We had begun to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned, at long last, to create together.